Welcome to session number 5 of the Anglican Tradition series. In this number 1, in session number 5, I'm going to look at tradition with a capital T, traditions, small t, and traditionalism, seeing from the summit. When you're on a mountain and you get up on the summit or on the ridges, you can see the landscape below, you can see people coming up the mountainside, you can see where people have stopped on the mountain, they may be eating lunch, they may be content only to go so far up the mountain on a trip. But generally from the summit, and seeing from the summit, you can see the broad landscape and lay of the land and understand where people are on their journey. Now when we think of tradition, capital T, the life of the church, that's the comprehensive and big vision of the life of faith, of theology, of liturgy, of philosophy, of public witness, of the arts, which have been part of the current of time in the Christian capital T tradition over the last 2,000 years and actually even before that, in terms of the Jewish sources and the classical sources of Christianity. And so anyone's concerned about their faith and wants to understand their faith in a meaningful manner, both in the life of the church and in the life of the world and their own personal journey, it behooves them to understand that great tradition, that great epic vision of faith. Now what happens often in people on their journey, depending on what Martin Heidegger says, thrown into the particular form of faith they either are born into or they come to Christianity in, it's usually a small t tradition. So a person, for example, comes into Christianity or is born into some form of Christianity in the Protestant small t tradition. It could be Lutheranism, it can be the Reformed tradition, it could be Anabaptism, it could be the conservative evangelical tradition, it could be the broader evangelical tradition, and there are various denominational spin-offs from those small t traditions within the life of the faith. And then of course there is the much bigger tradition of the Mother Church tradition, of which you find the Anglican, the Roman Catholic, and the Orthodox. There is traditionalism, in which a person is born into or comes to Christianity through a small t tradition, and they don't think seriously about whether whether that in fact is the fullness of faith or whether it is just a narrow understanding of the faith. So if I may return to the analogy again of the mountain and the landscape, a small t tradition is a part of the mountain that people assume is the fullness of the mountain, or they can stop in a various part of the trail and they only see in a limited way in terms of the greatness of the mountain and the grandeur of the mountain. The danger is to take a small t tradition, either some form of Protestant denominationalism, or even the clash between the Roman Catholic and Orthodox, as the fullness of the capital T tradition. So if we're going to see from the summit or see from a higher picture, we must be careful we don't become trapped in the tribalism of a small t tradition, and within a small t tradition don't even think critically about that. For not to think critically about one small t tradition, whether it's Lutheran, Reformed, Anabaptist, Evangelical, is to become a traditionalist. We are all, in one sense or another, come to Christianity or are born in a tradition. No one can avoid being a part of a tradition. Those who want to turn their back against tradition, that's just another form of tradition. So those who choose to oppose tradition inevitably do so in the name of another tradition. So there's no escape from coming out of a particular interpretation of faith, which is a tradition. The task then of a mature faith, and then one that wants to grow and see the faith in all of its fullness, is to be thoroughly grounded in the great Christian tradition itself. And the more one is grounded in the fullness of that tradition, you can see the small t traditions as merely a lower part of the greater mountain of faith, and one must always try and avoid traditionalism, in which there's just a mindless acceptance of a small t tradition, and then people assume any other form of faith is either subservient, wrong, heterodox, or some other thing. And so in the faith journey, the first step is to thoroughly immerse oneself in the fullness of the tradition, and then one can see the small t tradition one comes from for what it is, and hopefully avoid in the process traditionalism, which is a mindless acceptance of usually some form of a small t tradition on the faith journey.